If you want to understand this, you have to stop thinking like an American. You have to start thinking like a Russian. We should probably just define BRICS. It's an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. And all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders and said, well, who's left? That will be the up and comers, the fastest growing developing economies. And they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favorite of South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you probably can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. That's how it evolved. So for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meeting, and it's famous, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes there are 3 or 4, say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, this was Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president at the time, of course, Putin is president today, Hu Jintao for Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister of Brazil, who actually was Lula da Silva at the end. He got arrested later, went to jail, got out, now he's back. So they sat down and they said, we actually have a lot in common, a lot to talk about, and we added it up. We're a pretty powerful group. So they formalized it. And then in 2009, they had a summit conference, a formal summit conference with an agenda and all that in Yekaterinburg in Russia, in the Russian Federation. For those who know their Russian history, that's the place where the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar and his ministers and the Romanov family. But I guess the Russians have a little bit of a sense of humor. But anyway, that's where they had this summit, and they solidified, okay, we're a group, we're going to work together. And they did. And over the coming years, they multiplied numerous subgroups. That people say it's the BRICS meeting coming up. Well, yeah, that's the Leaders Summit. They have about 190 meetings a year. They have working groups on women's rights, sports, environment, climate change. You could go on and on. It's a very active, what they call secretariat, which is central organization. A few years later, in 2014, they formed what they call the New Development Bank, NDB. Well, what's the New Development Bank? First of all, it's got 100 billion of capital, part paid in, part callable, but it also has borrowing power with that kind of ownership and that kind of capital on the balance sheet. They've got hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing power. They could easily get a pretty good credit rating. And the purpose is to make loans for development projects to the member countries. And by the way, there are stockholders of the New Development Bank who are not BRICS, but they're kind of in the club. Well, what does that sound like? Multilateral? Well, it's the World Bank. That's exactly right. On their own terms, with their own governance. Okay, the following year, they created something called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Well, what's that? Again, they threw in a couple $100 billion from the members. China was the biggest contributor. Again, with borrowing power. So take a couple $100 billion times 5 or 10, that's your power. And this institution was designed to be a swing lender to members who were running trade deficits or facing a run on their currency or facing the prospect of having to close the capital account. Exactly what we saw in 1997, 98, by the way. I was there for that one. We ended up with long-term capital. But a pool that is a swing lender to countries with balance of payments deficit. What does that sound like? That's the IMF. That's the IMF. So basically, they copied the World Bank. They copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like this has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They kind of run a show, very methodical. So they duplicated the World Bank. They duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership. And there are, I think, 21 or more countries. Well, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted, starting with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. You can debate the method, but just if you do purchasing power parity, you get over half of GDP, 30% of the global landmass. I could go on and on. My point is, I learned development economics in the 1970s. We had something called the third world. It was like, it was Russia or, Soviet Union and the US. And then there was the third world. And all you knew about them was they were poor and get them off the runway. We actually had a runway theory of how you'd grow. Turned out to be wrong, but that's what we learned. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military. And again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call, US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. So that's who this group is. Now, there are a couple other groups that may join forces with the BRICS. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Everyone's like, what the heck is that? And this has been around for a long time. This goes back to the early 2000s. This was the answer to the EU. So, well, you got the EU, we got the EEU. Now it's Russia and some Central Asian republics, and Belarus and Tajikistan. I'm not saying this is France, Germany, and Italy, but it is a group that have reduced tariffs and improved trade between themselves. And there's another powerful group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, led by China. And these are mostly Central Asian republics, including Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and some others. But they're all talking to each other. Now, what's the common denominator? Well, it's basically Russia and China. China's a member of two. Russia's the only country in the world that's a member of all three. So through pretty simple inference, you can say, hey, Russia and China are running the show. And it's very likely that when this thing plays out, and I'll talk about the thing, I realize we're glossing over that, but when this new currency plays out, that those other countries will join in. When you do that, and I found a really cool widget. It's a map of the world that's blank, and you can go country by country and fill in by color. Just click on it and give it a color. And I did that. And I was like, oh, okay, here's the BRICS, it's 5 countries or whatever. Well, here are the applicants, it has another 20. Here's the SCO, a few more. Some of them are members of both. Here's the EEU, has a few more. Again, many are members of both. And you keep going. And all of a sudden, like a light bulb goes on. I said, that is Halford Mackinder's global island, what he called the world island. And this goes back early 20th century, first, probably greatest geopolitical theorist in history. But he had this idea of the world island. That is exactly what they're building. Now, why is that important other than the obvious, which is more collective economic and population power? Pick your metric. This dominates the world. Well, for one thing, if you're going to have a currency union, the more countries you have, the more likely you are to be successful. In the past year, what are the headlines? China and Saudi Arabia talking about selling oil for yuan. Brazil and China do large multi-product currency deal where they accept each other's currency. UAE, China, same thing, selling oil for yuan. Russia, China, using yuan and rubles as payment methods for whatever they sell to each other. Russia sells natural resources, China sells semiconductors, manufactured goods, and so forth. And there are a number of those. I don't have to list them all, but there are 10 or 15 of these. The reason they've all fallen short, and very few of them have actually come to fruition despite the headlines, is when you have two countries and they're going to trade with each other and accept each other's currency, and you can do that, you're limited to what you can do with that currency. This is why the Russia-India thing is starting to break down. Russia's been pumping oil to India. India's been paying in rupees, but how much curry do you need? I mean, what's Russia going to do with all the rupees? And Russia's starting to balk. They're like, hey, we're up to our eyeballs in rupees. We need a better system. When you have a multilateral, multi-country currency union, that problem goes away. Russia sells oil to China. China pays in BRICS, the BRIC currency, pays you in BRIC. But Russia can take the BRIC and turn around to Argentina and say, or Brazil maybe, and we'd like to buy some Embraer aircraft. And Brazil gets the BRIC currency, and they can turn around to China and say, we'd like to buy some rice. And then China takes, et cetera. You've solved the quasi-barter problem. You've solved the problem of what to do with pile currency that you really can't use other than certain goods and services, but not everything you want. There's an analyst who's brilliant. I read his stuff all the time. I'm like, man, you're so smart. And I just really follow him very, very closely and give him a lot of credit. But he said, you can't have a currency union without a common fiscal policy. And I said, have you not heard of the euro? I mean, there is no common fiscal policy in Europe. Don't tell me that Italy has the same fiscal policy as the Netherlands or that Germany has the same fiscal policy as Greece. They don't. They do have a central bank that issues the currency, has a little bit of gold, but not a lot relative to the size of the economy. But there's no common fiscal policy, and there's no common bond market. To this day, there's no such thing as a bond, I'll call it a euro bond, backed by the full faith and credit of the entire European monetary zone. It doesn't exist. You can buy German bonds in euros, you can buy Italian bonds in euros, but you can't buy a euro bond backed by all of those countries. So they don't have a common bond market. They don't have a common fiscal policy, but they do have a currency union that's very successful. So now back to the BRICS, they finally have the scale. They finally solved this problem, which I described. When you have two countries, you're not too much further ahead than barter, but with 30 countries or 40 countries, you've solved that problem. That's the background. It's been 17 years in the making. It's not an overnight thing. They replicated the World Bank. They replicated the IMF. Now they're coming out with a new currency. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And I tell people, if you want to understand this, you have to stop thinking like an American. You have to start thinking like a Russian. It took me a long time to figure this out. This is the kind of thing that pretty much only Russia could come up with. What is the BRIC? And by the way, I don't know if they're going to call it a BRIC. I'm saying BRIC for convenience. It doesn't matter what they call it, but I just call it a BRIC for the time being. They'll come up with a name. Who knows? The value of the BRIC is not determined with reference to any other currency. It's determined with reference to gold by weight of gold. It's math, it's logic. Now we're back to Aristotle's transitive law. This is the key. This unlocks the whole thing. Aristotle said, if A equals B equals C, then A equals C. The B can drop out. It's logic of the transitive law. What the BRICS have done is they have dodged the biggest bullet, the thing that caused Britain was ultimately to fail, the thing that potentially stands in the way of all this. They've defined their currency by weight of gold. Now, a weight of gold has a dollar value, but it's not fixed because the price of gold is going to fluctuate daily, minute by minute, right? So what's going to happen is the whole huge gold market in dollars is still going to exist. In fact, the BRICS want it to exist. I've never seen an international monetary economic problem that has created more confusion. I won't say misinformation, that's a little trite, but just confusion or maybe deliberate hyperbole than this one, because this is not the petro yuan. This is not the petro ruble. This is not a gold-backed yuan. This is not a gold standard. This is not the end of the US dollar. It's not the end of the euro. It's not the end of the world. It's not any of those things, but that's what everyone's running around shouting about. It's none of those things. In fact, quite the opposite. And this is where the Russian mentality comes in. The BRICS want the dollar to be around. They want the dollar gold market to exist because they get the free ride. The dollar has to do all the dirty work in the gold space, and BRICS get the free ride. By declaring one BRIC equal to a weight of gold, again, weight's the key, they just let the dollar gold market go wherever it goes, and the BRIC is worth an ounce or whatever, kilo, whatever. Yeah, the dollar equivalent under the transitive law changes, but they're not pegged to the dollar. They're not fighting that fight. I analogize this. It's like you're in your house, and in the backyard, your landscaper is like digging trenches and putting in plants and sweating and doing all this work, and you're sitting there with a glass of iced tea enjoying the view. In other words, the BRICS get to free ride on the dollar gold system, and they want that system. They don't want it to go away because they get the benefit of a gold value. Now think of what the BRICS don't have to do in this scenario. They don't have to buy gold. They don't even have to own gold. They do, but no one in the world has enough gold to back a currency. This currency, the BRIC, will not be redeemable into gold. Now, maybe there's a dealer somewhere who will take it. That's between you and the dealer. But it's not like you're going to be able to march down to the People's Bank of China with a pile of bricks and say, give me the gold. They're not going to do it. So it's not redeemable. But they're not going to make a market. They're not going to maintain a value because they don't have to, because it's by weight. They just get to sit back and piggyback on the dollar gold system and let the dollar do all the dirty work with one twist. And here's the Russian contribution. This is the ultimate fiat currency. The word fiat in Latin means I say so. Well, they say so, and there it is. Basically, this is a bet. This is a bet that the dollar is going to collapse against gold over time. I think that's a very good bet. This is not a 3-month forecast. I'm not saying gold is going to go up or down in the next week. Who knows? But over time, now we're into what? Debt to GDP ratios, annual deficits, dare I say, modern monetary theory. All these ideas are ruining the dollar, and everyone can see it, but not yet. And so if you want to launch this new currency and you say, hey, long term, the dollar is going to collapse in terms of gold, I'll hook my horse to this wagon called gold by weight, and I'll just reap the benefits. And I don't have to do a thing. Here's the twist I like. And this is how it's going to play out. Now you're the United States. So you're like, uh-oh, looks like I've been painted into a corner. What can I do? Well, one of the things you could do, I've told the Treasury this for years, they don't listen. I mean, they invite me in, but they don't listen. One of the things you could do is buy gold. But what happens when the United States buys gold? The dollar price of gold goes up, and the BRIC gets stronger and the dollar gets weaker. Checkmate. In other words, the US is now in a box where you can't even get out of it by buying gold, because you're going to weaken your own currency relative to gold in the process, and the BRICS are just going to sit there and not lift a finger. It's genius. I got to credit the Russians. I'm not saying the Chinese couldn't think of something like this, but this has got Russia's fingerprints all over it. People have been talking about this for 20 years. The Great Reset, the end of the dollar, the collapse of the dollar, gold to the moon, etc. And it's never played out. The dollar has these huge embedded advantages in the form of its reserve currency status, not because everyone loves the dollar or they even love the United States, but because we have the only bond market big enough to absorb global savings. The US Treasury market is huge, it is liquid, but it's got a whole infrastructure. Primary dealers that bid at auction, when issue trading, settlement, clearance, futures hedging, options hedging, depository trust corporation, settlement, on and on and on. It's got this huge infrastructure of laws, rules, and regulations that they've been building for a long time. But above all, it has the rule of law that people just trust it. Don't have to like the dollar, don't have to like the United States, but you trust the market. The US, in response to the war in Ukraine, broke the trust. They froze the US Treasury assets of the Central Bank of Russia. Unprecedented. I'm a sanctions expert. I work for the intelligence community. It was part of what I did was look at sanctions and a lot else. And as far as I'm concerned, I know that our BRICS friends agree, that's a default. Maybe S&P would call it a selective default, but Russia made the money. They bought the treasuries. They're entitled to principal and interest. And we're saying, no, you can't have the principal and interest. We're not paying you. Well, that's a default. I don't care how Janet Yellen wants to dress it up. And it was a shock. But worse than that, everyone else in the world was watching. Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, Malaysia, Turkey, and others. And they're saying to themselves, gee, what if the United States doesn't like what I did? What if they don't like my policy? What if there's a war in my neighborhood and they're not in favor of it? Are they going to freeze my treasuries? Well, until a year ago, you would say, of course not. They would never do that. Well, they did in the case of Russia, and they will potentially in the case of these other countries. So that was the catalyst. The idea of getting out from under the dollar, yeah, it's been around a long time. The feasibility of that was limited, capped really by the absence of a bond market big enough to absorb global savings. But now the countries are saying, well, what good is it to have my savings in treasuries if you're just going to steal them? I'm not saying BRICS are wonderful all out of the gate, but at least it's not dollars. At least it's not maintained on a digital ledger at U.S. Treasury. And at least you can't steal it. And so that was the catalyst that drove this thing from a 17-year project to, hey, warp speed, let's get it done. How do we do it? And there we are. This is back when the Iranian sanctions were a big deal. This is before Russia. I said, this stuff works to an extent. It's not perfect, but it does work. And we did drive Iran to the bargaining table for the JCPOA in 2015. So I'm not saying it's completely ineffective. I said, but you guys are you're weaponizing the dollar. You're taking it too far and you're going to get a backlash. How many times can you punch the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? That's what you're facing. The US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency and it will always be the global reserve currency. I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull say sterling is the global reserve currency and it always will be, etc. But hubris is a good word. In plain English, taking it for granted. I mean, if you take your status for granted, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff and not worry about it, but you can't take your status for granted. You have to earn it every day. We got the trust. We started with the trust, earned, like I say, since 1791, but we blew it. I don't really think our adversaries can destroy the dollar, but I think we can do it ourselves. And I say China's not even close. China's not going to be global reserve currency for, I don't know, maybe never. They don't have any of those things. They don't have primary dealers. They don't have auctions. They don't have a large bond market. They don't have a rule of law. Who trusts the Russians? But then in thinking about the BRICS currency, I had another one of these like aha moments, like where a light bulb goes on. I said, oh, I was writing or something, doing some research on World War I. Basically, the history of government finance of war is what I was looking at. And I saw this Liberty Bond poster. And it was, Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty with a torch. And she, instead of the tablet, she had like a Liberty bond. And she was like, come on, America, we got to win the war. Buy Liberty bonds. And I read like 4 or 5 books on the Spanish flu of 1918. They didn't know until 1930 what caused the Spanish flu. They didn't know what a virus was really until the electron microscope, but they had a sense that it spread around. So in Philadelphia in 1917, there was going to be this big parade to buy Liberty bonds. It was like a freedom, win the war pep rally. And all these doctors at the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere were like, don't do this. You're going to get 100,000 people on Broad Street and, they're all going to die of the Spanish flu in effect. And they went ahead anyway. They did it because for 2 reasons. One, that's how important it was. But 2, there was more extreme censorship under Woodrow Wilson than there is today under Biden. I know that sounds like it can't be true, but it was. They were arresting people. You couldn't write a newspaper article about the Spanish flu because it was considered bad for morale in terms of the war. And in fact, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not in World War I. They were not a belligerent. So their newspapers like, hey, we got this flu, and they were writing all about it. And the rest of the world's like, hey, I read the Spanish newspaper said they got a flu. So they called it the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with it, but they were the only country that was allowed to talk about it. But what that did, if you look at the history of the Liberty Bond was the beginning of the retail investing market in the United States. Prior to World War I, U.S. wars were always financed by big shots, dealers who did it, but that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example, contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds. And if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market because somebody will start making a market in it. And let's say you go to a typical Brazilian and you say, hey, you got 2 choices. You can buy a Raiz-denominated bond or you can buy a BRICS-denominated bond. What do you want? Multiply that by the world. That's not going to happen overnight by any means, but I think there is the potential for an indigenous bottom-up retail bond market in the BRICS currency for for the reasons I mentioned, that over time, sooner than later, perhaps could give you something like a reserve currency status. This thing is so well thought out. Things that I would have objected to as recently as a couple of months ago. I said, well, it won't happen because. I've now modified my because. I'm like, no, actually, it could happen. So the BRICS know this, and they are laying their own cables. Now, easier said than done in terms of protecting them, but they want to have encrypted, secure communications and payment channels. Again, they've been screwed over by the West. We kicked them out of SWIFT. We kicked them out of other interbank payment systems. They ended Visa. Visa's no good in Russia. MasterCard's no good in Russia. The banks can't transact in dollars, certainly. Okay, this is the 12th largest economy in the world. It's the largest landmass in the world. It's the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, etc. But you're saying you can't be part of the international payment system. Well, there's a simple solution to that, which is build your own. And that's what they're doing. But what Keynes wanted, he wanted world money. He wanted the Bancor. He didn't like the idea. He wasn't against gold, not at all. But he was against the idea that somehow only the dollar would be tied to gold and everybody else would be tied to the dollar. That meant you had to go to the US via the IMF and say, Mother, may I, devalue or whatever, because the US was in charge. Keynes said, let's have one currency unit, a world money. He called it the Bancor. And the other thing he did, I've read all his papers, he started his research with a commodity basket. What's a Bancor worth? Same problem the BRICS are facing. What's a Bancor worth? He said, well, you could have so many barrels of oil, so many bushels of wheat, so many tons of copper, et cetera, through this commodity basket. And he very quickly discovered that commodities are not quite as generic or homogeneous as people believe. They're oil, yeah, but there's 72 grades of oil around the world based on sulfur content, viscosity, transportation costs. They're not all the same. So through a process of elimination, he just said, well, why don't we just use gold? And gold's easy. It's not that it's pretty and shiny, but it's an element. It's not even a molecule. It's atomic number 79. It's either gold or it isn't. There's no debate about what gold is. And it serves the same purpose, which is it gives you an anchor. And anyway, that was rejected. The BRICS deliberations, they were talking about a commodity basket. I kind of laughed. I said, they're going to end up with gold. They're repeating Keynes' process, and they're going to have the same result, which is they're going to find it's not really feasible, and they're going to end up with the world money tied to gold. That's what they're doing. Is the Fed the ultimate buyer of last resort of treasury? Yes, but there's an intermediate buyer, which is the U.S. banking system. In the 1950s, a typical large U.S. bank balance sheet was 40% treasuries. That was normal. That wasn't like hoarding. Today, it's about 5 to 7%. I think you'll get a phone call to Jamie Dimon and all the other CEOs. They'll call them first to say, people got to buy bonds. And of course, they're all under the thumb of the U.S. government, and they will. So you might have a pretty good cushion of bond buyers before you have to turn to the Fed and expand the Fed balance sheet. It doesn't really solve the problem. It just passes it around the banking system. By the way, the Chinese are doing something very similar right now. Everyone's like, why hasn't People's Bank of China sold more dollars? Well, it's because they're making the banks do it. The commercial banks are selling the dollars and propping up the yuan. And we can see something similar in the United States. So that's one. The other thing, the BRICS, what they've done, this is part of the brilliance, they've opted out of the exchange market. Because normally if the dollar is getting weaker, you're getting stronger. That's bad for exports. It's currency wars. That was my first book, Currency Wars. By defining the currency by weight of gold, not dollar amount, they're out of the foreign exchange market. Like they can just sit back and watch the show. But there's no end to financial panics. What's different about this, we may be looking at a tempo that's a lot faster. It's not every 7 years or every 10 years anymore. The U.S. is losing the war in Ukraine badly. You might even see Poland come in and bite off the western half up to Lviv, and Russia take the bottom 1/3, including the entire coastline to Odessa, and leave a little rump state, landlocked rump state around Kiev, maybe. There's no way to cover this stuff up. The New York Times and the Washington Post, I read them the same way I read Pravda during the Cold War. It's all lies, but they're valuable lies because it's good to know what the other guy's lying
Exactly.
about. You must have a reason for that. It must be important to you. So there's intelligence value in lies, and that's why I read the Times and the Post, because I made a big deal about sourcing. If you can't trust the New York Times, the Washington Post, or NBC, or any of that stuff, how do you find out what's going on? I mean, I'm not on the battlefield, I'm not even in London. And it was hard. I mean, I'm good at it, but that was hard. That took months to track down sources and websites that you could rely on. It wasn't like the Russian Defense Ministry.